Think your school is strict? British classrooms once operated under a disciplinary regime that would horrify today's students. Teachers were legally allowed to strike children with canes until 1998. Pupils knelt on hard floors until their legs went numb. Board rubbers were thrown at heads. Were you ever made to wear one of those humiliating hats because you struggled to read? These weren't isolated incidents of abuse. They were official school policy, recommended in training manuals and defended as character building. We're casting tough memories back to 21 old school punishments that sound completely fake, but inflicted real bruises and trauma, starting with the undisputed king of them all. The cane was the undisputed king of school punishments, a thin length of rattan or bamboo that lived in the headmaster's office like Excalibur. You'd wait outside contemplating your sins, then receive between 1 and 6 strokes across your palm or backside. The welts lasted for days. Official guidelines codified the technique: strike the hand, not fingers, use canes no thicker than half an inch, keep punishment books. Grammar schools used it liberally. Boys received it far more than girls. The last legal caning in state schools occurred in 1987, though private schools continued until 1998. The anticipation was part of the punishment. Schools deliberately made boys wait days, letting dread build. Next up, its more democratic cousin. The slipper was the cane's democratic cousin, available to any teacher willing to remove their footwear. PE teachers particularly favoured this method. You'd bend over whilst the teacher administered sharp whacks to your backside with a gym shoe, often in front of the entire class. Whilst caning required paperwork, slippering often went unrecorded, existing in a grey area of acceptable force. Some teachers kept specific slippers signed by previous victims, like grotesque yearbooks. Most prevalent in boys' schools during the 1960s and 70s, it persisted into the early 90s. The effectiveness came from immediacy and public nature. Instant consequence without bureaucratic overhead. Coming up next, the punishment that turned writing implements into weapons. The ruler across knuckles was the quick draw option requiring no preparation. Chatting during reading, thwack. Forgotten homework, thwack. The wooden ruler would come down sharply across knuckles, sending pain up your entire arm. Metal-edged rulers occasionally drew blood. This wasn't formal corporal punishment, it was considered classroom management. Primary and secondary teachers used it freely. Girls received it as often as boys, unlike the gender-segregated cane. The throbbing ache lasted through subsequent lessons. Certain instructors developed specific techniques, angling rulers to maximize impact or targeting the sensitive area between thumb and forefinger. The practice declined in the 1980s, though it continued until the 1998 ban in some classrooms. But physical pain was only one weapon available. The dunce cap represented punishment as public performance art designed to humiliate rather than hurt. This tall, conical hat with dunce written across it was placed on struggling or misbehaving students who sat in the corner facing the wall. The punishment dates to the 13th century philosopher John Duns Scotus, whose pointed hat symbolised learning before being ironically inverted into a symbol of stupidity. In British schools, it persisted into the 1960s. The power lay entirely in humiliation. Standing wearing a hat proclaiming your inadequacy created social shame. Physical punishment couldn't match. Particularly cruel was its application to children with undiagnosed learning difficulties, essentially punishing disability as moral failing. By the 1980s, it was considered barbarically old-fashioned. Our next punishment literally brought students to their knees. Kneeling on hard floors transformed the body into its own punishment device. Students knelt on bare floorboards or concrete for periods ranging from 10 minutes to entire lessons, hands on head or behind back. Particularly popular in Catholic schools, it also appeared in state schools. Some sadistic teachers placed students on heating grills or specified kneeling on uncooked rice. 10 minutes causes genuine pain as body weight compresses the kneecap. 30 minutes can cause numbness and difficulty walking. Extended kneeling could lead to bruised knees, damaged cartilage, even bursitis. Yet this was considered acceptable throughout the 1960s and 70s. Unlike a quick caning, kneeling required sustained suffering that dominated consciousness. By the 1980s, it had largely disappeared. Now let's look at corridor punishments. Standing in the corridor with hands on head was the school equivalent of being put in the stocks. Teachers ejected disruptive students, positioning them outside the classroom door with hands clasped atop their head for the remainder of the period. After 20 minutes, shoulders would burn and arms would tremble. This solved two problems, removing the disruptive element whilst maintaining punishment and supervision. The student remained visible through the door's window and served as warning to others. Secondary schools used this extensively in the 1970s and 80s. Many institutions designated specific punishment spots in corridors. The hands-on-head element wasn't universal. Some schools had students stand facing walls or hold heavy books at arm's length. The practice faded in the 1990s as schools moved toward inclusion. But public humiliation took other creative forms too. Public humiliation through forced reading transformed academic shortcomings into entertainment. Teachers selected particularly poor homework and compelled students to read it aloud, often with running commentary highlighting every error. You'd stand at the front whilst classmates sniggered, the teacher's sarcastic interjections punctuating your humiliation. Especially prevalent in grammar schools during the 1960s through 80s, teachers read out spelling errors in exaggerated voices or paused dramatically at grammatical mistakes. Some kept worst work files, rereading classic examples months later. The method weaponizes learning itself. Students struggling academically face public mockery that reinforces inadequacy. Those with learning difficulties suffered worst. Modern safeguarding would never permit this. Next, we'll explore a punishment that literally filled the air with chalk dust. The blackboard duster clap was performance art, a teacher's way of reclaiming attention through startling violence. When chatter reached intolerable levels, the teacher would grab two board rubbers and slam them together directly beside the offending student's head, creating an explosive crack and cloud of chalk dust. Particularly popular in the 1970s and early 80s, theatrical variations emerged, instructors approaching with exaggerated stealth before the sudden clap. The chalk cloud would coat the students' hair and clothes, marking them physically and socially. The explosion of sound triggered a fight or flight response. Some students reported temporary hearing issues after aggressive applications. The method declined not through banning but through technology. Whiteboards replaced blackboards in the 90s. Now let's examine perhaps the most traditional punishment. Standing in the corner was psychological punishment distilled to its essence, using isolation and boredom to modify behaviour. Students faced the corner for minutes or entire lessons, cut off from instruction and social interaction. Primary schools used this extensively from the 1960s through the 80s. Teachers sometimes specified nose-to-corner positioning. The punishment required no equipment, yet effectively removed the disruptive element whilst delivering humiliation. Younger children found isolation genuinely distressing, whilst older students bristled at the infantilizing nature. Duration varied wildly. 5 minutes was lenient, 15 standard. Some teachers left students cornered for entire lessons. The combination of boredom, isolation and missed learning created genuinely unpleasant experiences. The practice faded in the 90s as educational theory shifted toward engagement. Our next method took tedium to new heights. Writing lines was punishment as mind-numbing labour, designed to consume hours whilst teaching nothing except resentment. You'd write a specific phrase dozens, hundreds or thousands of times. "I must not talk in class," repeated until your hand cramped. Teachers specified exact numbers: 50 lines, 200, 500 for serious offences. Ubiquitous in British schools from the 1960s through the 90s, instructors provided lined paper and insisted on perfect handwriting. Others specified writing with the non-dominant hand. The most sadistic assigned lines with deliberately long phrases. 200 lines could take 2 or 3 hours of mindless repetition. Enterprising pupils developed shortcut techniques, holding multiple pens between fingers, though teachers generally caught such innovation. Educational theory questioned this in the 90s, leading most schools to abandon it. But teachers had even more creative ways to weaponize everyday objects. The board rubber or chalk thrown at students represented punishment as projectile. Teachers launched the hefty wooden board rubber or chalk pieces at chattering students, aiming for shock value. The heavy rubber would thud against the back of an inattentive head whilst chalk exploded in satisfying clouds. This peaked in the 1960s and 70s when such physical assertiveness was considered acceptable classroom management. Certain instructors developed legendary accuracy, able to nail specific students from across the room. The threat was often sufficient. A teacher lifting the board rubber sent a clear message. Throwing objects at children would today result in dismissal and prosecution, yet it was standard practice. The physical risk wasn't insignificant. Board rubbers could cause genuine injury. The approach declined in the 80s as corporal punishment fell from favour, but physical punishment was only one tool. Old-style detention bore little resemblance to modern after-school supervision. Students would be locked in classrooms for 1 to 3 hours after school in complete silence, performing pointless tasks. Some teachers assigned copying from textbooks, entire chapters transcribed word for word. The worst detentions involved simply sitting in silence. Detention typically ran until 5 p.m. or later, meaning missed buses and angry parents. Saturday morning detentions existed for serious offences. Grammar schools used detention more extensively, often combining it with losing privileges or missing trips. What made old-style detention effective was its inefficiency. Modern detention involves completing work. Old detention existed purely to punish. The social cost was significant. Missing clubs, sports practice, or friends marked you as a troublemaker. The system peaked in the 70s and 80s before gradually softening. But some punishments took students outside entirely. Litter duty transformed students into unpaid labour. Offending students spent break times, lunch hours, or after-school patrolling grounds with bin bags, cleaning up after obedient peers. The work was genuine. Schools relied on these punishment details for groundskeeping. The variety was impressive, cleaning blackboards, organising stockrooms, helping caretakers paint, picking weeds, scrubbing graffiti. Secondary schools essentially ran free labour schemes. Individual instructors developed preferred tasks, creating informal specialisations in the punishment economy. Litter duty put you on public display, marking you as a troublemaker. You'd finish dirty, tired, aware you'd sacrifice social time for menial labour. This approach remains in some schools today, though modern safeguarding requires closer supervision. But specialised punishment roles existed beyond simple labour. Left-handed punishment transformed a natural trait into a moral failing. Teachers physically prevented children from using their left hand to write, tying the offending hand behind their back or to chairs. The ruler came down sharply on any left-handed attempt. Left-handedness needed to be beaten out, particularly prevalent in Catholic schools where left-handedness was associated with sinister forces. Literally, sinister derives from Latin for left, but state schools enforced it throughout the 1960s and 70s. Teachers believed they were helping children. The reality? Forced right-hand writing caused coordination problems, letter reversal, and psychological trauma. Some developed speech impediments from the neurological confusion. Punishing children for something beyond their control was particularly cruel. 10% of the population is naturally left-handed, yet they were made to feel defective. The practice faded through the 80s as understanding improved, but teachers had another way to ensure long-term consequences. Confiscation without return was theft legitimised as discipline. Teachers permanently seized items brought to school violating rules: toys, comics, trading cards, electronic games. Teachers maintained confiscation boxes that functioned as black holes, swallowing possessions without any formal return process. Particularly prevalent in the 70s and 80s when toy crazes swept playgrounds. Yo-yos, Rubik's Cubes, football cards, Transformers, all seized if brought despite bans. Instructors would confiscate items mid-lesson, simply plucking offending objects from desks. "You shouldn't have brought it," was the standard response. What's legally questionable is that it constituted theft. Teachers had no right to permanently deprive children of property. Yet thousands of items vanished into desk drawers and staff room cupboards. Parents became more assertive about property rights through the 90s, but some punishments extended beyond single incidents. Exclusion from school trips, weaponized experiences, denying students access to memorable events as punishment for accumulated misbehavior. Throughout the term, warnings would accumulate until finally, you're not coming on the museum visit, castle trip, or residential week. You'd watch classmates board coaches whilst remaining behind, particularly devastating for residential trips, the week in Wales, geography field trip, history excursion. These were major social events where friendships were forged. Exclusion meant missing social integration, returning to a class full of shared experiences. Many institutions announced the threat months in advance to incentivize good behavior. Missing a major trip created lasting social consequences. Classmates would discuss adventures for weeks whilst you had nothing to contribute. This approach remains common today, perhaps the one old-school punishment that survived. But educational punishment could take more creative forms. Copying dictionary pages represented punishment as pointless educational theatre. Teachers assigned specific pages or numbers of entries. Copy pages 247 through 249, or copy 50 words starting with M, creating hours of mechanical transcription. The punishment pretended educational value whilst being purely punitive, particularly popular in English departments during the 70s and 80s, where teachers could frame it as vocabulary building. Instructors got creative, assigning obscure sections or setting impossible standards for handwriting that would force complete restarts. The most punitive would assign full pages from unabridged dictionaries, consuming entire evenings. What made this soul-destroying was its mechanical nature combined with false educational justification. Your brain would glaze over after the first dozen entries. As teachers abandoned pretending punishment was educational through the 90s, this practice largely disappeared, but physical discomfort could be inflicted in surprisingly specific ways. Sitting on hands during assembly was punishment as sustained discomfort. Students caught fidgeting or misbehaving would be positioned at the front with hands trapped beneath thighs, cutting off circulation. They'd sit through entire assemblies unable to shift position. After 5 minutes, hands would tingle. After 10, they'd go numb. After a full assembly, standing revealed hands turned pale or purple, pins and needles flooding back. The position also prevented any note passing or fidgeting. Primary and secondary schools used this throughout the 70s and 80s. The sustained nature meant suffering mounted throughout rather than being over quickly. Pupils reported genuine pain, particularly those with circulatory issues. Understanding of physical punishment broadened through the 90s, leading schools to abandon this. But specialised documentation served its own disciplinary purpose. The punishment exercise book was bureaucratic punishment, requiring students to maintain a dedicated notebook recording every transgression. After each incident, you'd write detailed entries, date, time, offence, teacher involved, punishment received. Reflective paragraphs were sometimes required. The book served as ongoing documentation, escalating consequences as pages filled. Grammar schools particularly favoured this system in the 70s and 80s, viewing it as teaching responsibility. Students presented their punishment book during check-ins, accumulating consequences based on entries. Full pages might trigger detention, full books meant parental meetings. This required students to document their own failings, active participation in your own discipline. Writing, "I disrupted French class by talking," forced acknowledgement beyond immediate consequence. Certain pupils took perverse pride in full punishment books as badges of rebellious honour. Schools moved toward computerised tracking through the 90s, but sometimes punishment was simply about making you wait. Standing outside the headmaster's office was punishment as psychological warfare. Students sent to the head would spend periods ranging from minutes to entire lessons standing in the corridor, waiting to be summoned, contemplating whatever serious punishment awaited. The waiting was deliberate. Heads often had students wait whilst they finished other business. The headmaster's corridor was typically isolated from main traffic, often in older, quieter buildings where sound carried. You'd stand there, perhaps seeing previous offenders exit in tears, whilst your imagination conjured increasingly dire consequences. Specific waiting spots existed: a chair, bench, or designated floor section. Your mind would cycle through possibilities: the cane, suspension, parental summons. The uncertainty was designed to be almost worse than the punishment itself. Headmasters would deliberately call students in, ask questions, then send them back out to wait more. This approach largely disappeared alongside corporal punishment in the 90s. But perhaps the simplest punishment was also among the cruelest. Missing break and playtime was social punishment disguised as time management, depriving students of their only unstructured time. Students would be detained in classrooms whilst others flooded outside for freedom, forced to sit in silence whilst laughter and play filtered through windows, ubiquitous across all age groups from the 1960s onward. For primary children, missing playtime was genuinely devastating. Break represented freedom, social connection, and physical activity. Being confined whilst peers played denied not just recreation but social participation. Playground games had rules requiring regular participation to maintain status. Repeated losses could affect friendships. What made this effective was how it created absence rather than presence. Unlike detention, where something unpleasant happened, missing break was about missing positive experiences. The window view of others enjoying themselves twisted the knife. Teachers appreciated it because supervision was minimal. The punishment remains standard today, perhaps the ultimate survivor of old-school discipline, precisely because it seems so innocuous. If you enjoyed this journey through British educational history, check out our video on 21 old British jobs that sound fake, but were totally real. These 21 punishments represent a disciplinary landscape that's vanished almost entirely. The late 90s abolished corporal punishment, and within a generation, the entire system became culturally unthinkable. Yet millions of adults carry vivid memories of canings, corner standing, and endless lines. Understanding this history shows how radically our society has changed in treating children with dignity and respect.